When Lieutenant Commander Jake Merrill called her Captain Brooks in front of her entire family, the backyard went silent, because not one of them, not even her parents, knew Talia was an officer, let alone a commanding one. The sun cast a burnished gold light over the sprawling ranch as guests mingled around high-top tables scattered across the manicured lawn. The air buzzed with laughter and clinking glasses. Montana's mountains stood in the distance like quiet witnesses. Untouched by the undercurrent of tension Talia Brooks felt humming just beneath the surface. Captain Talia Brooks stood near the back porch, deliberately removed from the center of celebration. Her Navy-issued sunglasses concealed her expression, but her posture, straight, composed, effortlessly authoritative, betrayed her years of service. No one noticed. Or rather, no one cared to. It was Brandon's day, after all. Her brother, Brandon Brooks, the man of the hour, was basking in the glow of his retirement celebration. At 40, he was stepping down from a lucrative position as CTO of a tech startup that had been acquired for 8 figures. A catered barbecue spread, custom ice sculpture, and a slideshow of Brandon's achievements played on loop on a mounted screen. "Brandon's always been the brilliant one," their mother, Lorraine, had said earlier that afternoon while fluffing the cushions in the sunroom. "You know how he is, always pushing himself. Visionary." Talia had nodded, her face impassive. She'd heard variations of that sentiment since she was 7. No one mentioned that she'd flown in from San Diego just hours ago after finalizing a fleet logistics restructure and signing off on the debrief from a humanitarian mission in the South Pacific. She hadn't mentioned it either. They wouldn't ask, and she wouldn't offer. They still believed she worked in Navy logistics. Filing reports, as Brandon had once jokingly put it. Paperwork on a boat. She had never corrected them. At some point, it had stopped mattering, or so she'd told herself. Her gaze drifted across the lawn to where Brandon stood, tall and charismatic, surrounded by colleagues, former professors, neighbors, and extended family. His wife, Marcy, stood beside him, beaming. Talia's own name was not mentioned in the toasts or introductions. When she had arrived earlier, her mother had handed her a tray of deviled eggs to set out. "Could you help in the kitchen, sweetheart? Brandon wants everything perfect." She did what she was asked, as always. Aunt Val made her way over now, gripping a mimosa and fanning herself with a program that had "Celebrating Brandon Brooks" embossed in gold foil. "Talia, dear," she sang. "Still doing your Navy thing?" Talia offered a polite smile. "Yes, ma'am. Well, you're so brave. Living on ships and such. I don't know how you do it. Do you still do paperwork?" Her voice was light, but her eyes carried a well-meaning ignorance. Talia nodded, swallowing her pride like she had done so many times. "Something like that." "Well, bless your heart," Val said with a kind smile before floating off to refresh her drink. "Something like that." In truth, Talia had commanded 2 destroyers, served in multiple overseas deployments, and led a classified rescue operation that resulted in her being quietly awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Medal, a distinction that only a handful of living service members held. It was a mission that cost lives and nearly her own. But it wasn't the kind of story you shared over potato salad and punch. Besides, what would be the point? Her father's voice pulled her back. "Talia, can you help your mother refill the ice buckets?" he called from across the lawn. "Of course," she said, crossing the yard. "Thanks, Pumpkin. You're always so helpful." It wasn't meant to diminish her. Not consciously. But that was the thing with her family. They were so used to seeing her in the role of supporter, not centerpiece. Brandon was the headline, she was the footnote. In the kitchen, she found her mother wrestling with a large cooler lid. "These guests are like locusts," Lorraine muttered. "I knew we should have gotten another 20 pounds of ice." Talia helped lift the lid with one hand and scooped ice into fresh buckets with the other. Her strength, though small in motion, came from years of hauling gear and moving through war zones. No one here knew. No one had asked. When she stepped back out, Brandon was mid-speech. A microphone had appeared in his hand, and guests had gathered like bees to a hive. "I just want to say thank you," he said, beaming. "To everyone who supported me through this crazy career. To my brilliant team. And of course to my family. My amazing parents. And my little sister, Talia, still sailing the 7 seas, or at least sorting supply manifests, right?" Polite laughter erupted. Talia smiled faintly, her eyes behind her sunglasses fixed on a distant point just above the crowd's heads. She felt nothing. Or at least, she hoped she didn't. She keeps the gears turning in the Navy, Brandon added. One Excel sheet at a time. A louder laugh this time. Lorraine dabbed her eyes with a monogrammed napkin, proud tears glinting. Talia stood still. A woman who had survived mortar fire, midnight evacuations, political briefings, and shattered diplomacy. A woman who had built a career on steel resolve and silence. A captain addressed like a clerk. She sipped her iced tea. "Sorry I'm late," a voice said to someone nearby. Heads turned. Talia's breath caught in her throat. Lieutenant Commander Jake Merrill. Tall, in crisp civilian clothes but unmistakably military in bearing, he approached the gathering with the relaxed poise of someone who belonged anywhere. Jake. Of course he would be here. He and Brandon had been dorm mates at Caltech before Jake pivoted to the Naval Academy. He'd served under her command twice. Once during the Yemen rescue. And suddenly he was looking right at her. His brow furrowed. He took 2 steps forward, then froze. And then, like reflex, he snapped into attention. "Captain Brooks." The murmurs began. Talia slowly removed her sunglasses. Jake's voice carried across the lawn, firm and respectful. "I wasn't expecting to see you here, ma'am." Brandon's laugh caught in his throat. "Wait, what?" Jake turned, visibly confused. "You didn't know?" "She's..." Talia held up a hand slightly. "Calm. Measured. Let's not do this here." Brandon blinked. "Captain." Talia didn't reply. "Not yet." Silence descended, the kind that folds in on itself and leaves no room for breathing. It had begun. If you're enjoying the story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It won't cost you anything, but it will mean the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video. The silence that followed was louder than applause, because for once they saw her. Jake Merrill's words had cracked something open, and the pieces of Talia Brooks' long-hidden truth hung heavy in the summer air. She hadn't asked for this unveiling, not here, not like this. But the truth had always been patient, waiting for the exact moment it could no longer be ignored. "Captain?" her father echoed again, more a question than a greeting. Talia didn't flinch. She turned slowly to face the cluster of family and guests now caught between curiosity and embarrassment. Some looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. Others looked at Brandon, waiting for him to make sense of the moment. Jake, ever the professional, stepped back. "Apologies," he said, lowering his eyes out of respect. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "It's fine, Lieutenant Commander," Talia said, her voice even. She turned to the crowd. "Excuse me." She walked past the stunned guests, past the wine table, past the decorations announcing her brother's achievements in block letters, and slipped into the house. The air inside was cooler still. She paused in the hallway, letting the walls buffer the shockwaves. She hadn't wanted this. But maybe deep down she'd needed it. 18 years earlier, Talia stood at the edge of the Naval Academy's parade ground, watching the other plebes tighten their formations. Sweat streamed down her back. Her boots were too new, her body sore from drills. But her eyes? Focused. At 19, she was the quiet girl from Missoula who had dared to leave the tech-saturated success track of her family behind to serve. While Brandon interned at Stanford and began coding his first app, Talia woke at 0430, ran 5 miles, and memorized the chain of command like scripture. She remembered the first time she called home after getting her first stripe. Her mother barely asked questions. "Oh, that's wonderful, dear. You know Brandon just won the Campus Innovation Award, right? He's building something big. Always something bigger." At Annapolis, Talia learned to stop measuring herself against people who had never once entered her arena. She thrived in structure, honor, discipline. Her instructors called her precise, composed, unnervingly calm under pressure. And that calm would be tested more times than even she could have imagined. 5 years later, Kandahar. Dust blew into everything, your lungs, your eyes, your memory. Talia crouched beside a Marine with a shrapnel wound to the leg, pressure bandage wrapped tight. The medevac was still 15 minutes out. Gunfire echoed in the distance, and adrenaline had long since burned through her system. She was the ranking officer, and she didn't flinch. After the chopper lifted off, her commanding officer looked at her and said, You ever think about command school? She had, but she never said it aloud. Every mission added another layer, another scar the family would never see. That was the thing about service. The real medals were invisible. San Diego, 3 years ago. Her promotion to captain came with little fanfare. Just a formal ceremony on the deck of the USS Durham, her commanding officers present, her sailors standing proudly at attention. No parents. No Brandon. Just Jake and 2 other officers who knew what it took to reach that level as a woman, and as a black woman in a command position. She'd smiled for the pictures, then returned to her quarters and spent the evening reviewing a case report from Bahrain. 2 months later, she received the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for her leadership during a covert rescue mission off the Yemeni coast. 32 civilians had been trapped during a port bombing. She'd orchestrated the entire evac under fire. It was in the report. Her family never knew. Present day. Talia stood at the sink in her parents' kitchen, rinsing a glass she hadn't actually used. The motion grounded her. She heard the sliding door open. Jake's voice followed. "Permission to enter?" She gave a tired smile. "You never stop with protocol, do you?" He stepped inside, looking uneasy. "I didn't realize they didn't know." No one ever asked. Jake leaned against the counter. "Your brother looked like you'd slapped him." He wasn't wrong. I did let them believe I was just logistics. Admin, filing reports. Jake frowned. "Why?" She paused. "Because the truth wouldn't have changed how they see me." "Not really." He studied her in silence. "I thought restraint would preserve peace," she added. "Turns out, it just preserves misunderstanding." Jake's gaze softened. "I know you didn't want this moment to happen this way. But honestly, it needed to." Talia exhaled. "The Navy taught me how to lead a crew into hell and bring them out alive. But it never taught me how to ask my family to respect me." Jake gave her a quiet nod. "I respected you before I ever served under you. You lead with something most people don't even know how to define." Talia turned away, her voice low. "You think he'll forgive me?" Jake didn't answer right away. "Maybe. But that's not your responsibility." Out on the patio, Brandon stared at the crowd still buzzing from the truth bomb that had just detonated in the middle of his party. His wife whispered to him. His father looked dazed. Lorraine turned toward her son. "Did you really not know?" "She never told me," Brandon said flatly. "You never asked," Aunt Val muttered. That evening, after the guests had left and the sun had dipped behind the hills, Talia sat on the porch railing with a blanket around her shoulders. The sky was a deep indigo, stars just beginning to pierce through. Brandon stepped out and sat a few feet away. "You made me look like an idiot." She didn't turn to him. "That wasn't my intention." "Then what was?" Talia's jaw tightened. "To make it through another family event without being mocked for something you don't understand." Brandon ran a hand through his hair. "Captain Brooks. Jesus. That's what he called you." "That's what I am. Why didn't you ever tell us?" She turned now. "Why would I? So you could tell everyone I was trying to compete with you again?" "I've been overseas, Brandon. I've lost people. I've nearly died doing work you joke about in front of company." He was quiet. "Then, I didn't know." "That's the point." A long silence passed between them. "You've changed," he said finally. "No," she said. "I've just stopped hiding." He walked away furious, like she's committed a capital offense by becoming something he never expected. The next morning, the Brooks family house was quieter than usual. The guests were gone, and the leftovers from Brandon's retirement party sat in neat plastic containers in the fridge. The balloon arch in the backyard had sagged under the weight of dew, and the "Congratulations, Brandon" banner fluttered limply in the breeze like an afterthought. Talia sat alone at the breakfast table, coffee mug in hand, reading a local newspaper more out of habit than interest. Her uniform was folded neatly in her travel bag upstairs, but today she wore jeans, boots, and a plain navy t-shirt. Civilian on the outside. Always navy on the inside. Her mother entered the room without meeting her eye. "There's banana bread on the counter if you're hungry." "I'm good," Talia replied, sipping her coffee. The silence between them stretched taut. Lorraine busied herself rinsing dishes that didn't need washing. "You could have said something, she said at last. "About your position. About being a captain." "I could have," Talia agreed. Her mother glanced over her shoulder. "Why didn't you?" Because for 35 years you never asked. The words weren't angry. They were just true. Before Lorraine could respond, Brandon stomped in from the porch, clearly agitated. He looked like he hadn't slept. "We need to talk," he said flatly. Talia raised an eyebrow but didn't respond. She folded the newspaper, set it aside. "What you did last night," he began, then stopped pacing. "You completely humiliated me. In front of everyone. Jake, all our old friends, even Marcy's parents." "I didn't say a word, Brandon," she replied calmly. "Exactly. You didn't have to. You let Jake blow it up for you. He spoke the truth. That's not a crime." Brandon turned sharply. "You let us all think you were some glorified clerk. You let people, our family, pat you on the head and say good for you, while you sat on this secret. Why? So you could drop it like a bomb when the timing was right." Talia's jaw clenched, but she held steady. "Brandon, what is the problem here? You know that's not what happened." "Then what do you call it?" he snapped. "I call it restraint," she said evenly. "For years, I let you take every spotlight, let mom and dad gush over your promotions and awards. I didn't need applause. I just wanted to exist without being minimized." Brandon ran a hand through his hair and exhaled. "It's not my fault they didn't understand what you do." "No," she agreed. "But it is your fault that you made sure they never took me seriously. Every joke, every dig about me pushing paper or floating around the ocean doing nothing. You trained them to see me that way." Brandon looked stunned. Talia stood. "I've led sailors into active combat zones. I've made decisions that kept lives intact, or cost them. And not once, have I ever tried to make you feel small because of it. But you? You couldn't go a single evening without reminding the world that I was the footnote to your headline." He said nothing. "You're mad because your friend recognized me before you did. You're mad because you were blindsided by the truth that I'm not less than you. I never was." She walked past him and out the back door. The conversation might have ended there, but the fallout had just begun. That afternoon, Jake showed up again. He knocked gently before letting himself in, exchanging a brief nod with Lorraine in the hallway. Talia met him near the back of the property, standing under the old willow tree where she used to read as a teenager. "I didn't mean for this to become all this," Jake said quietly. Talia shook her head. "You didn't do anything wrong. You spoke to me the way you always do. Respectfully, like a fellow officer. My family just wasn't ready to hear it. I'm not sure Brandon will ever be ready." She gave a dry chuckle. "You'd think after all these years it wouldn't matter. But it still stings." Jake's expression shifted, careful but sincere. "I meant what I said. You're the best commanding officer I've ever served under." Talia looked at him. "Thank you." A beat passed. Jake took a breath. "I heard him speaking over the mic as I was walking into his party. I had no idea he was referring to you. He said some things about you, before he knew who you were. The way he talked about your job. Like it was unimportant. I don't like that." "That's always been the story," Talia said, crossing her arms. "I'm dependable, not impressive. Reliable, not exceptional. That's a lie." "I know. But they didn't." Jake hesitated. He's not just angry about being embarrassed. He's angry because the truth exposed something in himself he didn't want to face. That maybe you've outgrown this family story. And he hasn't. She nodded slowly, feeling that truth settle. "I didn't ask for this recognition," she said. "I didn't want Jake Merrill from his LinkedIn circle to be the one to peel back the curtain. But I'm also not sorry it happened." Jake smiled. "Neither am I." That evening, over dinner, things came to a head. Talia's father tried to steer the conversation toward safe ground. Updates from cousins, the new car he was thinking of buying, but Brandon wasn't having it. "Let's talk about what really happened last night," he said suddenly, setting his fork down with a clink. Tension crackled across the table. "Brandon," Lorraine began, but he cut her off. "No, Mom. Let's be honest. Talia let us believe for years that she was some mid-level assistant, and then dropped the whole Captain Brooks thing like a grenade." Talia stayed calm. "I didn't drop anything. Jake recognized me. That's it. You've been lying by omission." "No," she corrected. "I've been surviving in silence." Brandon's face contorted. "Why not just say it? Why let all of us, treat you like you were nothing special? Because I thought you'd never believe it unless someone else said it first." That silenced him. Their father cleared his throat. "We were always proud of you, Talia." She looked at him. "Were you? You threw a party when Brandon launched his company. When I got my first stripe, I told you on the phone and you said, 'That's nice, honey.'" No one spoke. "I let you believe what you wanted," she said finally. "That I was smaller than I am. But I'm not. I've earned every stripe, every commendation, every sleepless night. I didn't share it with you because you never made space for it." Brandon's voice broke. "I never meant to make you feel like nothing." "But you did," she said. Over and over. Marcy placed a hand on Brandon's, and for the first time, he didn't pull away. Jake, sitting at the far end of the table, caught Talia's gaze. She nodded once, a silent thank you. Later that night, as the house settled and the stars blinked back into the dark sky, Talia stood on the porch in silence. She was no longer invisible, but the spotlight came at a cost. Still, she wasn't afraid of the light anymore. She had lived through worse, and she had chosen, finally, to be seen. By Sunday morning, the storm had passed, but its aftermath lingered like the smell of rain on scorched pavement. The Brooks household moved cautiously, its members orbiting each other with wary silence, as if speaking too loudly might reignite the emotional quake from the night before. Talia sat alone on the porch swing, the worn wood creaking beneath her as she read from a slim Navy leadership manual. She wasn't studying. She had memorized its contents years ago. But something about the crisp, clean structure of protocol soothed her. "Are you free to talk?" She looked up. Brandon stood in the doorway, hands shoved deep in his pockets, his expression guarded. "Sure," she said, gesturing to the other end of the swing. He didn't sit. Instead, he leaned against the post, eyes on the lawn where the remnants of the party decorations lay curled and limp like defeated flags. "I've been thinking," he began, "about all the times I joked about what you do." Talia closed the book gently, waiting. "At first, I thought I was just being funny. No harm done. But now, I think I needed you to be small." She blinked. That wasn't what she expected. "I built so much of my identity on being the golden child," he continued, "that the idea of you succeeding quietly without all the fanfare made me uncomfortable. Like it challenged the story I've told myself my whole life." Talia looked at him fully. "You needed me to stay in the background so you could stay in the spotlight." He nodded. "Pretty much. There it was. I didn't mean to humiliate you," she said softly. "I just didn't want to keep lying about who I am." Brandon finally sat down. "You didn't lie. We just never asked." He leaned forward, elbows on knees. "I read about you online last night. The Yemen evac. The medal. You saved 32 civilians. You were 29. 28, she corrected. He shook his head. "You were leading Black Ops missions while I was still writing bug fixes for my app." "That app paid for Mom and Dad's kitchen remodel," she said with a wry smile. "Yeah," he replied. "But no one would die if I missed a line of code." They sat in silence. "You were right," Brandon said. "I was mad because Jake saw you for what you are before I did. Because for years I thought I was the standard, and you were just stable." She gave a quiet laugh. "You've always been the storm. I've always been the anchor." He turned toward her. "Are you mad at me?" She considered it. "Not anymore. I've outgrown that kind of anger." Brandon looked down at his hands. "I think it's time we outgrew the old family narrative, too." Inside the house, Lorraine stood by the window, watching her children talk. Her husband joined her with a second mug of coffee. "She never told us," he said, more to himself than her. "She didn't need to," Lorraine replied. "We didn't ask." He sipped his coffee, exhaling. "You think she'll forgive us?" "She already did," Lorraine said, her voice thick. "That's the part we have to live with." Later that day, the family gathered around the dining table for what was intended to be a casual lunch, but turned into something more deliberate. Jake had been invited again, and this time he didn't wear the polite smile of a guest trying not to overstep. He was part of the conversation now. Brandon cleared his throat and stood at the head of the table. "I want to say something," he announced. Talia arched a brow, but said nothing. Brandon looked around. "I spent a lot of time defining success by how loudly the world clapped for it. The medals, the interviews, the tech articles, and I assumed anyone without those things wasn't really trying." He turned to his sister. "But the loudest applause isn't always the truest. Some people fight wars the rest of us never see. And they don't do it for headlines. They do it because it's who they are. Talia blinked back, the sting in her eyes. Lorraine covered her mouth with her hand. Their father stared at his plate, eyes glistening. "And for what it's worth," Brandon added, "I'm proud of you. And sorry it took me 35 years to say it." Talia stood and crossed the room, pulling her brother into a hug. It wasn't dramatic or weepy, just solid. Real. Later that evening, after dishes had been cleared and conversation had softened into small talk and laughter, Jake and Talia walked together in the backyard under the first stars of the evening. "I wasn't sure how today would go," he said. "Neither was I," she admitted. "But maybe it was overdue." Jake glanced at her. "You ever really think about why you let them think you were just logistics?" Talia thought for a moment. "At first, I didn't want to seem like I was bragging. Then I started to wonder if maybe they liked me better when I was quiet. And somewhere along the way, I got used to hiding." Jake nodded. "It takes strength to stay quiet. But sometimes it takes even more to speak." She looked at him, something soft flickering in her gaze. "And what about you? How do you see me now?" Jake smiled. "Same as I always have. A leader. A force. Someone I'd follow into the fire if you asked." She smirked. "Let's not test that too soon." He laughed. "Fair." They stood in silence for a beat longer. Then Jake said, "You know, I've seen a lot of leaders. Some love the command. Some love the power. But the best ones, they love the responsibility. That's what you carry. It's what sets you apart." Talia looked up at the stars. "It's heavy, but I don't mind the weight." That night, as she packed her bag for the flight back to San Diego, Talia tucked her captain's bars into the side pocket. Not because she was hiding them, but because she didn't need to prove anything anymore. Her family saw her now. And even if it had taken too long, even if the recognition came with cracks and bruises, it had come. Some medals were never pinned on a uniform. Some were earned in silence, and finally understood in truth. Talia Brooks stepped into the hangar at Naval Base San Diego, the scent of jet fuel and salt air brushing against her skin like memory. The hull of the USS Keating gleamed under the afternoon sun, its deck bustling with movement. Young officers saluting, machinery humming, voices calling out over the wind. This was her world, her rhythm, her reality, and she was no longer shrinking from it. Captain Brooks adjusted her cover, nodded at the junior officer approaching, and returned the salute crisply. "Welcome back, ma'am. Good to be home, Ensign." The walk to her quarters was familiar, but different. As if the weight of hiding had been peeled off her skin, one confession at a time. Since the confrontation at Brandon's party 2 weeks ago, the silence that once formed a barrier between her personal life and her military life had lifted. Her parents had called twice. Her mother sent a card, awkward and heartfelt, and her father left a voicemail that ended in something that sounded suspiciously like, "I'm proud of you." And Brandon? He'd emailed her. Not just an apology, but a link to a website, a long post about his sister, the Navy captain, titled "The Strongest Person I Know Doesn't Need Applause." He had published it under his tech company's blog. It had gone viral in a quiet way, shared among veterans, sailors, women in uniform. Talia didn't ask for that either, but she appreciated it. For the first time in years, she didn't feel erased. That Friday, she was invited to speak at a panel hosted by the Naval Officers Leadership Institute. The topic was visibility and valor, leading with integrity in a world of applause. Jake Merrill sat in the front row, arms folded, pride visible in the softness around his eyes. When Talia took the podium, there was no nervousness, no false humility. Just clarity. "I used to believe restraint was the highest form of strength," she began. "To work in silence, to earn in silence, to lead in silence. But I've learned that restraint without recognition becomes erasure. And silence, while noble, should never come at the cost of your voice." She scanned the room, young officers, veterans, policy advisors. "I spent years allowing others to underestimate me, thinking that shrinking made things easier. But all I was doing was teaching people how to ignore me. And that was a lesson I had to unteach." A pause. "I am the first Black woman to command 2 multinational joint force operations in my division. I've led evacuations, coordinated disaster relief, and stood trial as witness in military courtrooms. And yet, I let my own family believe I filed paperwork. A few knowing chuckles rippled across the room. But this story isn't about blame. It's about boundaries. About no longer accepting a version of your life that dims your light just to make others more comfortable. She looked briefly at Jake, then continued. Leadership isn't about titles. It's about responsibility. It's about doing the work even when no one's clapping. Especially when no one's clapping. When she finished, the applause was loud, but this time, it didn't define her. It simply affirmed what she already knew. Later that evening, Talia sat in her modest apartment, the lights low, a single candle flickering beside a framed photo of her and her academy classmates on commissioning day. The silence here was chosen, not assigned. She was sipping tea when the doorbell rang. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened the door, her father stood on the other side, tie loose around his collar, expression unsure. Dad, I was in town for a meeting. Figured I'd take a chance. She stepped aside, heart thudding softly in her chest. He looked around the room, eyes catching on the awards in the corner, the Navy medal case on the shelf. He walked up to it and ran a finger lightly along the glass. Why didn't you tell us? He asked finally, without accusation, just wondering. Talia sat on the arm of her sofa. Because it never felt like it mattered to you. At least not more than Brandon's pitch decks and startup wins. He turned toward her slowly. We didn't know what to say, Talia. You always seemed fine. Strong. Like you didn't need it. Everyone needs to be seen, Dad. Even strong people. He nodded. You're right. We failed you there. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then her father walked to the table, opened his briefcase, and pulled out a framed photograph. It was one Talia had never seen. Her in uniform, saluting as her CO pinned her with the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal. Your mother printed this. She found it in a Navy News archive. She framed it last week and put it on the mantle. Talia blinked. She did. He nodded. Right next to Brandon's plaque. She smiled. She asked me to give this to you, he added. Just in case you thought we weren't paying attention anymore. Talia took the photo gently, touched. Thanks, she said. As he turned to leave, he paused at the door. For what it's worth, Captain, I'm proud of you. She didn't cry, but her throat closed with a quiet pressure that didn't need words. Weeks passed, then months. Talia returned to command, led a peacekeeping strategy exercise in the Philippines, mentored 2 junior officers through disciplinary hearings, attended a Medal of Honor ceremony at Arlington, and left a note at the grave of a lost friend. Through it all, she lived fully in her truth. Her family didn't change overnight, but they were trying. And for the first time in her adult life, Talia didn't have to compartmentalize her identity. She could be daughter and sister and captain, without apology. It was spring when Brandon visited her in San Diego. They sat on the beach, shoes off, wind tossing Talia's curls. He had his laptop open, typing code between long pauses. He glanced up. There's something poetic about this, you know. What? You, the quiet one, turned out to be the loudest example we have of honor. Talia smiled, watching the waves roll in. Maybe the medal they never saw was never meant to be worn. He raised a brow. Then what? She looked at him. Maybe it's how you live. How you lead. How you finally let yourself be seen. That was her story. She didn't need to shout, just stand tall when it mattered. Would you have told them sooner? Or let them hear it from someone else? Comment below and subscribe, because sometimes the best revenge wears a uniform and doesn't flinch.